Today I want to clear up 7 of the most common myths surrounding reverb. Why? Because it's an essential tool for every single track you produce, and so many producers seem to struggle with this. Now these tips are just my opinions, you might completely disagree, and that's absolutely fine. Feel free to slate them in the comments, but they have helped both me and my students get signed and released on some of the world's biggest labels. Okay, so firstly, let's look at the basic controls of any reverb. You probably already know this, so let's keep it quick. Reverb plugins are designed to create the illusion that the sound they're applied to is being played within a space, like a room, a hall, or even a cathedral. Now the main 3 controls of any reverb plugin are as follows. You've got the dry wet, which just determines how much reverb is being applied to that sound. 0 or fully dry is no reverb, full or 100% wet is only reverb, and none of the dry signal. 2, the reverb decay time, which is just how long it takes for that reverb to die out. And 3, the pre-delay, which just determines how much space there is before the reverb kicks in. If you imagine clapping in a big ravine, the pre-delay is the time it takes that first echo to get back to you. Now there are other controls depending on the plugin, like room size or shape for example, and we'll get to those shortly. Okay, so now we know what a reverb does and what the controls are, let's debunk these 7 myths. Myth number 1, reverb is used to make things sound big. Now when using reverb, it's easy to think it should just be applied to things that you want to sound like they're in a big space. But the one trick that really changed the game for my music production was realizing the power of a very short, specific type of reverb. Have a listen and I'll give you an example of the difference it makes, then I'll show you how to use it. First it's off, on, now off, and on. Now you might need to go back and listen to that a couple of times, but you'll notice how much more gelled together the second example was. And that is using a global room reverb. And every sound that we hear in the real world has a degree of reverb applied to it. It's very rare that you would hear anything in a completely deadened environment. And if you did, it would sound very unnatural. That's why having a room reverb can really help gel things together and just make it sound like it's all coming from one space. Here's how you do it. Now depending on which DAW you're using, the technique will slightly vary, but the idea is the same. So in Ableton you go up to Create, Insert Return Track, which is just another name for auxiliary channel, then we put a reverb on this and make sure that the reverb length is under half a second. That's very important, otherwise it's going to be too long. So I'm going to put about 400 odd. Looks good to me. I'm going to give it a slight volume boost as well, just because the Ableton reverb is a bit quiet. And now we can start feeding in our different elements into this reverb. So let's try the snare first, the hat, some of the breakbeat, so listen to the difference between that. Very subtle, but it just ties everything together. Quick pro tip, every time I start a new project, I already have a reverb channel baked into the template. I use this in every single track and it made a world of difference to my productions. Okay, so we can use short reverbs and we'll be looking at longer reverbs in a minute, but myth number 2 is that reverb only controls space. So let's listen to 3 different types of reverb on the same sound with similar settings and see if you can hear the difference. So it's subtle, but there. That's because reverbs don't only control time, but they actually control frequency, transients, stereo width, and modulation. And that's why there are lots of different types of reverbs you can use for different situations. So let's go through the main ones quickly, but there's a secret I want to share with you afterwards. First, we've got a room reverb. We're not going to go into that because we've already touched upon it in this video, but they're great for sending various instruments to, gelling your mix together, and having it sound like it's all coming from one space. The next type is a plate reverb, and that works particularly well on vocals. These are the good things, good things, good things. Because it's quite bright and distinctive, and it can really make them pop in the mix. Next is a spring reverb, and because it's modeled on a reverb that actually uses a coiled metal spring, it sounds quite metallic, and I think it sounds great on guitars. Next is a hall reverb, and that's particularly good for stringed instruments and anything you want to have a very long decay time. It works great on vocals too, especially if you use it on an auxiliary channel, and I'm going to show you how to do that in a couple of minutes. You've also got other reverbs such as convolution reverbs, shimmer reverbs, cathedrals, and gated reverbs too. So you need all of these different reverbs to sound pro, right? Well, this leads me on to myth number 3. Now remember how subtle those differences were in myth number 2? Well, If you've been producing for less than a year, you do not need to worry about different reverb types. You only need one reverb and you need to know how to get the most from it. If you try and learn lots of different reverbs just for the sake of it, and you don't know how to use one reverb properly, you are just going to be making your journey so much harder and so much more frustrating. Now, one premium reverb I really like and recommend is Valhalla Room, but you can just use the stock reverb that comes with your DAW. Now, once you've learnt that inside out, that's when it's a good idea to start getting a few of these other types of plugins to really bring out the most in your music. And that brings me on to myth number 4. You need to know what all of the controls do in your reverb. When you get a new phone, do you try and learn every single feature and function before using it? Of course not. You just learn the main functions that allow you to use it in the way that you want. It's exactly the same with reverb. There are a lot of different controls depending on the plugin. And yes, if you can hear the differences and the nuance and you know how to use them, that's great. And actually, we go into all these differences and nuance in my music production Accelerator, but that's because we are focusing on that last 5% to get to a professional quality. As I said, if you've been producing for less than a year, not only do you only need one reverb, you only need 3 controls: the dry wet, the decay length, and the pre-delay. And actually, you can mostly get away with just the dry and the wet and the decay length. So that's only 2 controls you need to learn. So here's an example of a track just using the Ableton stock reverb, and then we'll compare it to a track that has got some of these more fancy reverbs. So yes, you can hear that the second example does sound a bit better, but the type of reverb isn't the difference between it sounding good and bad. It's just that last 5% of special sauce. So make your life easier and just stick to one reverb for now. Now, at some point you are going to start hearing these differences, and that brings me on to myth number 5, which is one of the ones that annoys me the most: trust your ears. It's such a cop-out because your ears can't be trusted yet. They need to develop first. Couple that with the fact that your ears get tired throughout the day. You might be listening to a different pair of headphones or in a different studio environment. It really pays to use any tool that you can to help your ears out. And here's how I do it, and here's how I teach my students to do it. If you can, use reference tracks for guidance. Firstly, try and find a reference track that has similar source material. For example, if you're trying to set the reverb for a female vocal, select a reference track in the same genre with a similar kind of vocal as yours, instead of, say, a rap track where the reverb settings are going to be completely different. I've dragged in my reference track into a blank audio channel within my DAW, and first things first, we want to get it so that the levels are similar to our track. It's going to make it easier to compare apples to apples. So what I'm going to do is stick a utility or a trim plugin on there and just take down the volume a bit. But first, let's see what our track is kind of hitting at in the busiest point. So I'm going to open this loudness meter and just measure the LUFS value of our track. At the moment, it's hitting about -11 LUFS. Great. So now we can go to the reference track and just make sure it's hitting a similar amount. So I'm going to throw another one of these loudness meters on there. Just adjust this trim plugin until it's hitting about -11 too. That looks pretty cool. Okay, so the levels are about right. Next thing I'm going to do is synchronize it to my project. So I'm going to zoom in to the reference track, go to the first transient, and the easiest way to do this is just look up what tempo this track is in Google, or you can just warp it and do it by ear if you like. But I know this track is 125 BPM, so I can put that BPM in. I'm going to change it to repitch, and now we're set up for referencing the reverb. Secondly, find a part of that reference track where there's as little other things playing at the same time as the sound that you're referencing. This will make comparison way easier. So what I'm going to do is find a part of the reference track where it doesn't have loads of instruments playing. That sounds pretty good there. Cool, so I can really hear the length of the reverb. So what I'm going to do is just copy that part of the track over to where our vocal is, and then we can just loop that. And what we want to do is just turn off everything in our track apart from the vocal as well. So here are the dry vocals from our track. These are the good things, good things, good things. Compared with the reverb vocal of our reference track. You still make my heart beat fast. Start off by focusing on just the dry wet control and the decay length. So I'm just going to put a reverb on my dry vocals, like so. And then I'm going to take the pre-delay down and just focus on the dry wet and the decay length. These are the good things, good things, and just switch between the reference track and my track. If you dial it in too strongly, that can be a great way to set the decay length, and then you can take that dry wet back to the sweet spot. If the reverb's too quiet, it can be very hard to set the decay length and the pre-delay accurately. Here's an example of dialing it in too strong, so we can really hear the decay length. And you can, when you've got that decay length right, you can always bring that mix, dry wet control, back to the sweet spot. And it doesn't matter whether you do this on the channel or with an auxiliary channel, the process is pretty much the same. Sounding good. Deserves a sip of tea, I think. Now, another great tool is getting a pre-processed stem from somewhere like Splice or LoopCloud, so you can hear how it's processed and what the reverb lengths are doing. So here's how you do that. And if you want to help support the channel, please use my Splice link below this video. But I've turned off the vocals in my track, and I'm just going to go to Splice, search for vocals within the key that my track is in, which is C# major in this case, and just preview a few until I hear one that works in terms of how the reverb sits.
Maybe I ain't lost my way. Maybe you ain't gone too far. I had nothing left to say. We had left ourselves in the dark.
So you'll note that the tempo isn't correct, but that's okay because I'm really just listening out for the reverb and how that sounds and sits with the track. It does help to look for a vocal in the same key as your track, otherwise it can get a bit confusing. But at this point, I'm just going to download that vocal and then follow the exact same steps we used for using a reference track instead of just a vocal stem. So I can drag that in, make sure it's all synchronized up, match the levels, then A/B test between these vocal stems and our vocals and get the dry wet and the decay length right. Now, bonus tip, this isn't just great for reverb, you can also hear what kind of vocal delays are on the signal as well, but that's for another video. So if you want to see a video on how to use delays properly, do let me know in the comments below this. Nice one, I love ya. Now the key with referencing is that it can help guide you to a desirable end result with your reverb. And that brings me on to myth number 6, which is reverb is just another plugin to add to the chain. So there are two main ways of using reverb within music. The first is on the channel itself, and that's just when you would use it as you would any other plugin on your effects chain. And this is what most new producers do. So as you expect, you just drag a reverb onto the channel where your vocals are or the group, and then you can dial it in like so.
These are the good things, good things, good things.
The second is using reverb on an auxiliary channel. This is when you have a dedicated channel, much like the room reverb we looked at earlier. And to recap, it looks like this. We go up to Create, Insert Return Track, and then we just make sure that we add a reverb on that track itself. You'll want to make sure it's set to 100% wet, so we're not mixing the dry signal with more of the dry signal when we use these send controls to send it through to that reverb.
These are the good things, good things, good things. These are the good things, good things, good things.
Now, generally speaking, I'm a huge proponent of this second technique because it gives you so much more control over your reverb signal. Here's a quick example of the benefit of using reverb on an auxiliary channel. So I can add some saturation to warm it up, take out some of the low end, just to make sure that we've got a nice clean reverb, perhaps boost some of the high ends, and then compress it as though it's its own instrument. Not only that, but then I can add other cool effects on it as well, like this crystallizer. And now let's listen to what happens.
These are the good things, good things, good things. These are the good things, good things, good things.
And that simply wouldn't be possible if I had the reverb on the channel itself. Special sauce. So it sounds great, right? However, sometimes using reverb on the channel itself is the right call. The trick is understanding what you're trying to achieve, which is why referencing is so useful. So here are my rules of thumb for when and where to use specific types of reverb. 1, if you want a room reverb to gel everything together, use an auxiliary channel. 2, if you are using a longer reverb to add size to a channel, consider using it on an auxiliary channel because you've got so much more control over it. Check this out. So a couple of minutes ago, we touched upon what you could do if you're adding saturation and a crystallizer and things like that. But let's look at this standard hall reverb put in on the auxiliary channel. It's kind of washing out that main vocal a bit. So what we're going to do is add a compressor on the auxiliary channel, take the input, the sidechain input, if we hit this button, from the dry vocals, and then that's really extreme. And what that's doing is ducking the reverb tail from the dry vocals when the dry vocals are singing, and then the reverb can come back in and fill out the space when he stops singing. And this is a fantastic pro tip for getting your vocals to sound clearer without sacrificing a nice long reverb tail. Couple that with the fact we can EQ out the frequencies we don't want, perhaps boost the high end just on the reverb. We can also add some sidechain bounce against the kick just on the reverb tail. So many more options when using reverb on an auxiliary channel for this kind of use. 3. If you want to push something back in the mix and soften it, using a reverb on the channel itself can help soften some of those transients. And that one's great for vocal sound beds just to gel everything together. And 4. If you want to create a transition reverb washout, use a reverb on the channel itself. Just the bass. Which brings me neatly on to reverb myth number 7, reverb automation. Now, reverb is usually a set it and forget it type plugin where you dial in the settings and then you can just leave it. However, it can also be used in any manner of creative uses, and the key to that is by using automation. Now, something that made a huge difference in my productions was this notion of reverb automation. It can add so many dynamics and interest to your mix. So here are just a few examples, but really your imagination is your limit. So 1, we've got the reverb washout, which we just looked at, a great way to build transitions into drops and other parts of the track. 2 is the reverb suckback, where we can add extra dynamics and interest to a melody. And all I've done for this is automate the dry wet control with a reverb on the channel of the melody. So the reverb's going on and off, and it just adds more dynamics to that melody. 3, we've got the Skrillex size knob trick. Who writes these titles? My God. Where we're just using one of the other small controls to add extra texture and interest to a riff. Now this is really subtle and specific to the Ableton reverb, but if we listen to this riff and then we automate the size control on that reverb at very low values, you can get some really interesting but subtle textures to the sound. So this is it without the trick being applied. And now let's apply the size trick. So it just adds a little bit more character when you've got turnarounds at the end of riffs. Next, we've got the classic reverse reverb trick, which is a great way to introduce a new sound into your arrangement. Here are the vocals without a reverse reverb. And we want to use a reverse reverb to more smoothly introduce them. So what we need to do is create a new audio channel, then copy the first syllable of those vocals, paste it into the new channel and hit R to reverse them. Then we want to add a reverb onto that channel. I'm going to use the Valhalla Room, and I'm going to choose a decay of about 4 seconds. Now I want to record that reverse reverb, so I'm going to create another audio channel. Let's just call that reverse reverb. I'm now going to take the input from that channel, solo it and record it. Now we can delete that channel, hit R to reverse that reverb, and then just pull it up so it leads into that first vocal. And now this is the result we've got. And you can use that to introduce any instrument into your track. And finally, we have the incidental reverb. And this is when we automate the send control to fire off particular sounds for one-off reverb hits. Now, I think this trick works particularly well on claps at the end of a bar. So what I'm going to do is show you how you can set it up in the drum rack in Ableton. What we need to do is create an auxiliary channel, and we're going to call this Big Reverb. Big Reverb. Then we're going to put a nice long reverb on there. 100% wet, and about 5 seconds decay time. We can also put an EQ, take out the low end, and boost the highs a little bit. Now, within the drum rack, we want to hit this R button here, right click, create return chain, hit this routing button, and from this drop down menu here, select our new Big Reverb channel. Now we can close this R button, close the routing button, and now we have the send control showing up for each separate drum within the drum rack. Now what I'm going to do is right click, show automation in new lane, and just automate that send control on just for the end of the bar. And now when we reach the end of the bar, that clap is going to get sent out to our Big Reverb. Now, when you take into account the different effects you can also add to these reverbs before and after, you realize the possibilities are endless. And if you've got any that you try, do let me know in the comments below, because I'm always excited about trying out new techniques. Okay, now this last myth isn't really a myth per se, but it's so common I wanted to include it, so I'm just classing it as a bonus. And this is the key to getting the most from your reverbs. Everything you've learned up to now is going to be useless unless you dial this in right. And I can directly attribute this to me winning my first remix competition and getting my first manager. So it's incredibly important. It's about how to EQ your reverb. Now, a really quick rule of thumb is just roll off everything under 120 Hz for pretty much all your reverbs. This will help stop your mix being muddy, as reverberated bass frequencies can tend to really clog up your mix. Now, there are way more important lessons to learn about EQ, both for your reverb and every other element of your mix, and they are key to getting your music sounding professional. So I've put together the 8 biggest EQ myths I've seen over the last 25 years into this video here, and if you avoid these, coupled with your new reverb skills, I guarantee that your music will sound 83.4% better. Fact. But before you head over there, if you did enjoy this video, please like it, share it, and download my reverb guide completely free so you can use it for every mix you start. Thanks so much for watching, and I will catch you over at that next video.